Ever get that, like, kind of itchy feeling when an argument seems, logically sound on the surface, but deep down something just feels off?
Oh, absolutely. Like a perfectly formed syllogism that somehow leads you to a conclusion that just doesn't quite sit right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this weird space where logic, reality, and maybe even a bit of power dynamics all collide.
Because logic, as much as we revere it, isn't some pure objective force.
Mm.
It can be wielded in ways that, well, might not always reflect the whole picture.
Right. And to help us untangle all of this, we're going to be looking at this, let's just say, interesting document called What is a Virgin.pdf?
Catchy title, and surprisingly thought-provoking. It uses this really fascinating analogy to kind of poke at how we construct truth and how our own biases can seep into even our most logical arguments.
Okay, so set the stage for us. What's the setup for this virgin analogy?
All right, so picture this.
Yeah.
A lone woman arrives in this village, right? But here's the catch. It's a village entirely populated by men. Some catastrophic event wiped out all the women. You get the idea.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. Go on.
So this woman shows up and claims to be a virgin. And not just any kind of virgin. She follows this, let's call it, holy path that emphasizes her status. But her arrival sets off this whole chain of events, a logical dilemma that, believe it or not, mirrors a lot of the arguments people use against the existence of, well, God.
Hold on. A virgin, a village of men, and arguments against God. How on earth does that all connect?
Because both the woman in the document scenario and this idea of a true God, they bump up against this same problem. How can they be inherently good, all-powerful, the whole deal, yet seemingly powerless to stop suffering?
Ah, okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But how does the virgin part fit in? What makes that so crucial to the analogy?
The document uses the terms harlot and virgin, not just literally, but as these symbols, right? Harlot for falsehood, virgin for truth. It sets up a really stark contrast.
Okay, so there's this underlying binary of truth versus falsehood baked into the analogy from the get-go.
Exactly. And the document actually quotes this central argument. Is she willing to prevent death but not able? Then she is a liar. Is she able but not willing? Then she is malevolent.
It's like that classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Precisely. And this is where the document throws a curveball. Because that whole line of reasoning, that whole either-or trap, it only works if we assume the woman is lying about being a virgin from the start.
So it's like the argument itself is already rigged against the possibility of her being truthful.
Exactly. It presupposes that only falsehood, represented by the harlot, is even on the table. It completely excludes the possibility of truth, the virgin, right from the outset.
And that's a really important point because it forces us to ask, how often do we do that in our own lives? Make snap judgments based on these unexamined assumptions without even realizing we're doing it.
Right. We get so caught up in the logic, the surface-level argument, that we forget to interrogate the underlying assumptions that are often invisible, yet incredibly powerful in shaping our perception of reality.
And this whole idea of like pre-existing beliefs coloring how we see the world, the document actually digs into that too, right? There was that line about...
Oh, you mean they have turned the world upside down to make it say what they want it to say?
Yes, that one. It's like the document is saying that our beliefs, especially when we mistake them for objective truth, can actually blind us to alternative perspectives or even actual reality.
It's a form of maybe not intentional deception, but self-deception that can be really hard to break free from because it often feels so.
Right.
Yeah.
And this idea of turning the world upside down to fit our beliefs, it's not just some abstract philosophical concept either, right? I mean, we see it play out throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Think about Galileo. Put on trial, considered a heretic for challenging the idea that the earth was the center of the universe, or even the crucifixion of Jesus. All these examples where those in power use what they presented as logic, as reason, to silence dissent and maintain their own authority.
It's like that saying, history is written by the victors.
And it's not always a conscious, malicious thing either. Sometimes it's just easier, more comfortable to cling to what we already believe, even when evidence challenges those beliefs.
Which brings us to a really crucial point, this whole either-or way of thinking, this binary trap that the document sets up and then dismantles. It's saying that just because someone or something appears not able to act in a certain way doesn't automatically make them a liar or, like, inherently bad.
Right. It could just be a reflection of the limitations of their nature, the constraints of reality itself. The document gives this really interesting example.
And before you get to that, I just want to say, like, this concept of binary thinking, it's everywhere, right? Not just in these abstract debates. It seeps into our everyday lives, how we judge others, interpret information. It's insidious.
It really is. But yeah, the example the document uses is, well, could God, while still being true, be inherently unable to make 2 + 2 5? Because that would violate the very fabric of logic and reason that God, supposedly created.
Okay, that's a really interesting way to put it, because it highlights how our attempts to define something, even something as seemingly absolute as God or truth, can actually limit our ability to fully understand it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the core messages the document is trying to get across, that we need to move beyond these simplistic binaries, these either-or propositions, if we want to grapple with the messy, nuanced reality of, well, everything.
It's like we're, I don't know, almost programmed to seek order and simplicity, even when we're dealing with things that are inherently, well, messy.
Yeah, like we're more comfortable with a tidy lie than a complicated truth.
And what's so interesting is the document, it like subtly hints at something, well, kind of disturbing about that whole need for neat explanations.
You mean how those simplified narratives often end up propping up existing power structures?
Exactly. Like, remember that village scenario with the woman?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a prime example right there.
Yeah. It's like the men, they use their supposedly airtight logic to basically write her off, to justify what they're doing.
And to maintain their little power dynamic, right? They're in charge. She's an outsider. Their logic reinforces that whole hierarchy.
It's almost as if, I don't know, as if logic itself becomes a weapon,
Oh, 100%. A way to silence anyone who disagrees, to keep the status quo firmly in place.
Which is why I think it's so important for us to, develop what I'd call a critical ear,
To not just hear the words, but to really listen for what's going on beneath the surface.
Yes. To pay attention to the assumptions, the biases, the power dynamics that are always there, even if they're not explicitly stated.
And ask ourselves,
yeah,
who benefits from this particular story? What's being left out? Whose voice is being silenced?
The document also brings up this fascinating and kind of uncomfortable aspect of belief, which is self-deception.
Oh, that's a big one, right? Like sometimes we hold on to certain beliefs not because they're true, but because they're easier to swallow.
It's like in that village scenario, it's easier to believe the woman is lying than to grapple with the implications if she's telling the truth.
Especially if that truth shakes things up, challenges what they already believe about the world.
And that right there is why this document is so brilliant, because it forces us to confront that in ourselves, that sometimes we're more comfortable with a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth.
And being able to admit that, to be willing to question our own cherished beliefs. That's huge, not just for, personal growth, but for understanding how we fit into the world.
And speaking of questioning, can we talk about the title for a second? This "What is a virgin.pdf?" Like, on the surface, it seems provocative, maybe even a little, I don't know, immature.
Oh, yeah, totally. But the way the document uses it, virginity becomes this metaphor for something much deeper.
Right. It's not really about the woman or her, virginity at all, is it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
It's about using this scenario as a mirror, to examine how we define truth, how we recognize it, even when it bumps up against what we thought we knew.
So it's using something that seems simple, even kind of sensational, to get at something much more profound.
Exactly. It's about breaking free from those either-or boxes we were talking about earlier, those binary traps, and realizing that truth, real truth, is usually far messier and more nuanced.
Which, that leads to a pretty unsettling question. What other truths do we accept without really questioning them, just because they fit into our worldview, into what we want to believe?
And what happens when we start poking at those truths? Do they hold up, or do they maybe start to crumble a bit?
It's like this document isn't about giving us answers, is it? It's about asking the really tough questions.
And making us a little uncomfortable in the process, which, let's be honest, is often where the good stuff happens.
100%. Because being willing to sit with that discomfort, to be open to different perspectives, even when they challenge our own, that's where real growth happens.
It's about recognizing that our understanding of things, it's always evolving, always changing.
We've covered some seriously fascinating ground in this deep dive, haven't we? From logic puzzles to power dynamics to, the very nature of truth itself.
It's like a crash course in critical thinking, all wrapped up in this bizarre little analogy.
But there's one more thread I want to pull on before we wrap up. It's this, this unspoken element of power, right? It's not explicitly mentioned in the document, but it's there, lurking beneath the surface of that whole village scenario.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like a like a hidden current shaping everything that's happening.
Exactly. It's like at its core, this analogy is asking, who gets to decide what's true? Whose version of reality wins out?
And more often than not, it's those who already hold some form of power, wouldn't you say?
100%. And they use whatever tools are at their disposal to maintain that power, including, and this is the really messed up part, logic and reason.
Right. It's like in that village, the men's so-called logic, it's not about understanding, it's about control.
Totally. They use it to dismiss her, to justify their own actions, to maintain their dominance.
And the scary thing is, that's not limited to some fictional village, right? We see that dynamic throughout history, across cultures, even in our own lives.
Okay, so then how do we navigate that? How do we make sure we're not falling into that trap of like using logic as a weapon instead of a tool for understanding?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it starts with awareness, with being honest with ourselves about our own biases, our own blind spots.
So it's not just about being right or winning an argument?
No, not at all. It's about approaching conversations with a certain level of, like, humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
And that's tough, man. Like admitting we might be wrong. That goes against like our whole ego-driven wiring.
It does, which is probably why it's so important, because if we're not willing to question ourselves, to be open to other perspectives, then we're really just reinforcing our own little echo chambers.
And the world doesn't need any more echo chambers, does it?
Not unless we want to keep shouting into the void and wondering why nobody's listening.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say this whole what is a virgin.pdf thing, it's kind of brilliant in its own weird way, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's like this Trojan horse of an analogy sneaking in these really complex ideas about truth, power, and the limitations of our own thinking under the guise of something that seems, on the surface, kind of silly.
And it leaves us with this, I don't know, this lingering sense of like, wait a minute, what if everything I thought I knew
is maybe not the whole story?
Exactly. And that, I think, is the most valuable takeaway of all. That willingness to keep questioning, keep exploring, keep those critical thinking muscles flexed and ready to go.
Because the world is a messy, complicated place. And the only way to make sense of it is to embrace that messiness, to be comfortable with the unknown.
And on that note, I want to thank you, dear listener, for joining us on this deep dive into, well, the deep end of logic, reality, and the ever-elusive nature of truth. Until next time, keep those minds open, those questions coming, and never underestimate the power of a good thought experiment, even if it does involve a village full of guys and a lone woman claiming a very specific status.